Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Perfect wildlife images don't happen by accident, presented by Kurt Johnson. Kurt has been guiding with NatHab in North America since 2014, and today he's joining us from his home in Wyoming. Thanks for being here with us today, Kurt. I'll hand things over to you.
Thanks so much for that, and hello to everybody tuning in. It is a gorgeous day here in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, just outside of Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park. And as Kendall said, I guide mostly here in Yellowstone, but lots of other places around the world. And I've lived lots of different places around the world. So Yellowstone's kind of my home base, but do a little bit up in the Arctic and Alaska, Iceland, and Montana. And yeah, my background formally is in wildlife biology, and so that's been my passion since I was very young. And photography has always been a complement to my background in wildlife, and so I've always been a student of photography, and it's just been a great complement to guiding and research projects to do with wildlife, and ended up leading towards a big project that I wrapped up a few years ago of a comprehensive field guide to this ecosystem, which is near and dear to my heart. So let's go ahead and talk about what today will consist of. The idea is to sort of integrate the idea of wildlife biology, wildlife behavior, ecology, or how things are connected in this particular ecosystem, and how that can really enhance our understanding of a species, of an area. And in my experience, it can be a huge advantage to understand animals, to understand why they hang out where they do, and that can vastly improve our photography, just because we can become much better at anticipating their behaviors and what they might do next. So we'll talk briefly about this idea of phenology. We'll talk about that right away. And then this kind of odd idea of wildlife botany, of understanding the plants of an area can oftentimes lead to a better understanding of the animals and therefore improve our photography. We'll talk quickly about migrations, since that is something that varies throughout the year where these animals tend to hang out. We'll talk about behaviors that sometimes we can anticipate, and how that relates to both predators and non-predators. And then talk about how sometimes, as much as we understand something, we come across things in places we don't expect them, or animals engaging in behaviors we don't expect, and so things like that. And this photo that's up right now has to do with that last section. So this might seem like kind of an odd photo, but the biology and the ecology behind this photo is something that's just kind of mind-blowingly cool that we'll talk about towards the end. So let's talk about this idea of phenology. Phenology is basically something that many of us who spend the majority of our lives in the natural world and immersed in these ecosystems, we put a lot of thought into. And it basically refers to the idea of seasonal changes in the natural world. So in other words, we're paying very close attention to what's happening throughout each week. Each week is truly different in most places around the world when it comes to what we expect to see and behaviors and things like that, but might hold up even more strongly here because we have such strong seasons. So yeah, this is one part of phenology, is simply the fact that in mid to late September, our foliage, in this case we have cottonwoods and spruces beneath the magnificence of the Tetons, and just showing how this particular time of year is an excellent time of year for fall colors in this part of the world. So yeah, phenology is kind of an amazing thing to think about because it does vary so much week to week in this ecosystem. And so, for example, something that is great to be thinking about during early summer, this is a great time for baby animals. And so this is a baby moose taken in June a few years ago. And obviously this is the time that they look very different than even in 2 months from now. They grow very quickly. So by the time we're looking at the same moose in September and October, it's almost, you know, half as big as mom. So right now, this time of year, highlights for baby animals include baby moose. We've got bison that are about 5-6 weeks old. Brand new pronghorn are just being born right now. And the canines all have their litters that were born late winter. And so we have the opportunity to see things like wolf pups, coyote pups, and fox kits. So just when things give birth is a great thing to be thinking about when it comes to the idea of phenology. Along those same lines, one of the highlights for birds of prey in this area is the great gray owl. And so if we fast forward another month or so from now, this is something that we oftentimes can see in this ecosystem. And for some people, this species is actually a big draw because it is not a regular thing that we see, but we see them more frequently in this ecosystem than a lot of other places that they can be found. And so here you can see the phenology simply of a chick which has fledged, but still relying on mom and dad to bring in food. If you look carefully, you can see that this chick just got a little present from mom, and mom flies away while the chick 2 seconds later flips it over, goes down head first always, and swallows, and then very quickly after pictures like this are taken, they just start squawking again, trying to get that next meal from the parents. And then if we fast forward a little bit more, we get to probably the most interesting time of year for bison. Bison are definitely a highlight any time of year, but their rut, because their gestation is so much longer than other hoofed mammals in this area, their mating season actually begins in late July, much earlier than any of the other hoofed mammals. And so what that means is that during the month of August, our bison are by far the most interesting thing to check out. And so scenes like this become more common. The males are chasing the females, they're fighting one another, which is a really intense thing to see. And then they engage in this behavior of wallowing, which might sound a little bit gross, but what this bison is doing is he had just urinated into this wallow, into this dust pile, and then he's rolling in it to make himself smell extra sexy for the ladies. The ladies just seem to dig that. I don't recommend it though. And then if we fast forward another month and a half or so, we start to think about what bears are going through. And so the phenology of in this case, black bears, this is a brownish looking black bear. We call them cinnamon bears. And so during late summer through the fall, these guys recognize that the days are getting shorter, the temperatures are dropping, and their torpor, which is just a less deep hibernation, is right around the corner. And so in a picture like this, you know, we might be drawn to the expression of the bear, something like that. But ecologically, the most important thing about this image is, if you can see my cursor, is right up here, because this is a hawthorn shrub, and those berries are why this black bear climbed up this shrub, is to access those berries. And so we know that they are going to be more active than they were during midsummer when temperatures are warmer, and they don't have this physiological change taking place, which is sometimes referred to as hyperphagia, where they're trying to pack on 10 to 20,000 calories every single day in preparation for the winter. And you can kind of do the math on how busy these animals need to be, because each of those berries on a shrub like this is about 1 calorie. And then another highlight for sure in late September is the elk. The elk go into rut, and certainly in the Rocky Mountains, one of the coolest things to be able to check out is a bugling elk. That's what this animal is doing in this photo. This is a big bull who's basically communicating to other elk that he's around, that he's a big boy, and he's ready for love. And so they'll collect harems of 20 to 30 females, and then the male just exhausts himself to the point he can't even eat, because he's so focused on mating, on keeping his harem near him, and fighting off other bulls. So it's a really intense time to be a bull elk. And then moving forward in time just a little bit, we start to pay attention more so to the Rocky Mountain bighorn population, because they have the latest of all of the ruts, of all of the courtships. And so one of the really exciting things about mid to late November are moments like this. And so one of the nice things about this time of year is that there's very few people that come to this ecosystem in November. A lot of things start getting shut down. Yellowstone closes up typically by early November, and a lot of the activities have diminished. But the wildlife viewing is still excellent in November, and moments like this are definitely one of the things that we look for. And one of the sections we'll be talking about will be behavior, and this is kind of an overlap between phenology and behavior and migrations. All of it sort of ties together. But this is a moment that happens very quickly. So we can go out there looking for bighorns, and we see the males, and they're doing their thing, just kind of hanging out. And you can watch them for hours without them clashing like this. And then suddenly you have to be ready for it, because it comes very, very quickly. You get this quick moment of intense violence. One of the things you'll notice in a lot of bighorn pictures where they are clashing with one another is that this is a very violent act, one of the more violent things in North American wildlife behavior. And there's so much energy when the males hit. The energy passes through their body, and then they usually raise their back feet so that the energy can pass through their entire body, because if they don't, those back legs will break. So you'll notice that in a lot of imagery is that those back legs are off the ground. And then definitely not a lot, all the images I'm sharing are images that I would do anything with that are, you know, my best work. And so a lot of what I'm trying to communicate is just the phenology and the behaviors that are just helpful to understand. So this image was taken December 24th, a few years ago, and this gives you a sense of when moose lose their antlers. So let's say that one of your priorities was to come out to a place like Wyoming and photograph the big bull moose. You can tell in this image that he's lost one antler, but he's got the other. And that's right along the correct timelines that we expect for moose to shed their antlers. They shed them earlier, quite a bit earlier than elk and deer. And so typically, by the time people are coming here the first week of January, the moose do not have antlers anymore. So this guy probably shed that second one shortly after that. One of the things that we'll talk about is how many of these animals are less predictable than others. And this would be a good example of an animal that you're always pretty lucky to come across, and probably more likely in the winter. But by understanding a little bit about how this animal spends its life, and especially in the wintertime, it's kind of a gift if you do come across a porcupine during the winter months, because there's a good chance it'll stay in that same tree for a week or more. So you can kind of count on the opportunity to come back and observe or photograph that animal again. And I was hoping to talk a little bit about the idea of wildlife botany. And so this goes very much hand in hand with phenology. And what I find myself saying frequently is that in order to be a good wildlife enthusiast, wildlife photographer, it helps enormously to be a little bit of a botanist. And that's because most of the large animals we have in the Rocky Mountains are all herbivores. And so they have different preferences of what food sources they tend to go for. And so knowing where their favorite food grows will help us understand where they're most likely to be found. So one example is an image like this. This was taken in November of last year on sort of a foggy morning in the Tetons. And so one difference you can observe is that there's 3 bull moose in this image, and all of them have their antlers. And so it is typically by New Year's, most of our moose have dropped their antlers. But the reason I'm showing this image is to show what's surrounding these moose. Not only the mountains, but the plants that surround the moose are very critical in terms of where they can be found during that time of year. And so to show this, this is an image of two different plants. You can see at a glance they look pretty similar, especially when you look at the leaf type. They both are three-lobed leaves, but the difference in terms of a moose thinking about good nutrition is enormous. So you can think of the species on the right as being something like toxic Brussels sprouts, and the image on the left to a moose being like a filet mignon, something that would be very good for them. And even though these plants grow right next to one another, the sagebrush on the right is basically going to be left untouched by moose and many other animals. And then right next to it, the bitterbrush is going to be what the moose are driven to. So during early winter, from November through January, in order to be successful in finding moose, we aren't necessarily thinking about the same things as the summer months. We're thinking about, okay, where in Jackson Hole or in the ecosystem is bitterbrush growing the most abundantly? And it turns out when we go to those areas during that time of year, we can see 10 to even as many as 30 moose in one small area, which is pretty amazing considering that they are not social animals. And that's not them herding together like bison and elk herd together. It's just that there's that much food available that they're drawn to that. And certainly another thing that we think about is how their diet transitions during the spring and summer. So currently we have some of our moose that do go after aquatic vegetation. My best guess is that this is a behavior that we just don't see quite as much in Grand Teton and Yellowstone as in other areas. Even up in Montana, the moose seem to do this a little bit more. And definitely they seem to do this more in the Northeast and Canada. But still, this is something we can see. And moose are very good swimmers. They can be just wading through the water, eating aquatic vegetations. And believe it or not, they can actually dive down. They can dive down 10, 15 feet. They don't look like good divers, but it is something that we get to see. I probably see it about once every couple of years. But right now, we aren't thinking about the bitterbrush as much. We're not thinking about the aquatic vegetation as much. We're thinking about this plant in particular if we're interested in hanging out with moose. So this is a plant that does very well in ecosystems we refer to as riparian. So anything near water, lakes, creeks, rivers, has an abundance of willow. And this is a very nutritious plant that becomes their almost exclusive diet during this time of year. So if we go out, and moose are a priority for something we want to spend time with, then we go to the areas that have the most willow. So right now, most moose that we are seeing are hanging out by rivers and creeks. This is an image taken just a few days ago of one of our grizzlies, and I will talk more about our grizzlies of Grand Teton. It's not the core of this presentation, but there's just so much cool stuff going on this year. I can't avoid it, and it does sort of represent an understanding of bear behavior. But this image does a nice job of showing what bears are thinking about. They're not thinking about willows. They're not thinking about bitterbrush, but they are very omnivorous. They eat a lot of plants this time of year. And so if you look carefully at these yellow plants sticking out of the bear's mouth, that gives you a sense of one of the important food sources to them. And this is an expanded image of that plant, which is called desert parsley. And it does smell like the parsley you sometimes get as a garnish. And so one of the best places to see grizzly bears right now are these big open fields that have this abundance of this particular plant. So thinking about plants which are tied to what we refer to as plant communities, that takes us to many different places. We have aspen communities, we have conifer communities, we have sagebrush, riparian, and then we have alpine as well. And so here's this, maybe the cutest animal in North America. This is the pika, which is more of an alpine animal. It looks a bit like a rodent, but it's actually more closely related to the rabbits. And it has very low tolerance for high temperatures, which is why in the Rocky Mountains, it's almost like the equivalent of polar bears representing climate change, because this is a species that is not going to fare well with higher temperatures. And we are seeing them go up and up in elevations as temperatures are driving up. But a great animal to photograph, very fun, very cute. And as you can see, they spend a lot of the summer collecting vegetation and making these things within their rocky slopes called haystacks. And if you sit and watch pikas for long enough, you can kind of see there's patterns. There's certain routes that they will more consistently take, and they'll always go back to that haystack. And so an understanding of what they're doing throughout the summer months will oftentimes lead to better pictures like this one, where it's got a nice big mouthful of vegetation. And then we have grasslands. And so animals like our bison are going to be only where there's grass. And so the image on the right just shows what these animals think about nonstop. So when you're a 2,000-pound vegetarian, you're basically spending most of your life either eating or traveling somewhere to eat more, or bedded down and ruminating or re-eating what you ate earlier. And so spending time with bison is going to be spending time out in the open grasslands, and to a lesser extent in the sagebrush. And so we rarely see them, for example, in dense forests, but typically out in the open like this. And this image represents what our bison look like right now. This is a female and probably a calf that's 3 or 4 weeks old. You'll notice they are kind of reddish their first couple of months. And so an image like this, I would say, is relatively easy to get in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And I think that's why if you ask the average visitor coming to this area what the easiest animal to photograph is, I think most people would say bison, because you can get fairly close to them, in cars especially. They don't like people outside of cars. And they're pretty cooperative subjects. Having guided here for over 20 years, I guess I feel more and more over time that bison are one of the more difficult animals to photograph, because they are relatively, I should say they're less complex than a lot of our other animals. And so because they're just thinking about grass, not a whole lot else, that it's hard to capture like the power of a bison, for example. And so by going to the same sort of habitat during the winter, and personally I think bison are a bit more photogenic in general, I was lucky enough to get an image like this, which shows a big bull bison just plowing his way through very deep snow. And same habitat, different time of year, but a little bit more interesting of an image, and one that I don't get very often. Is something that really kind of shows what a bison's all about, what its world is all about. And so images like this, based on where we know that they like to hang out, are more obtainable. And then just a few slides about migrations, because in addition to understanding what animals eat, and overall trends and patterns of animal behavior, a lot of our animals in this area, and of course around the world, are very migratory. So this is just a snapshot of one species in particular in the Grand Teton, Greater Yellowstone area, of our elk. And so if you look at this, what you can see is that elk are coming from all the way up in Yellowstone. They're coming from the western side of Grand Teton. They're coming up from Togety Pass and making their way south. And if you look at these arrows, a lot of these arrows end up right here. And so that is the National Elk Refuge. And so knowing where these elk are going to be coming through can be an advantage, because you're more likely to have a moment with these elk and anticipate some of their migratory habits. and movements like this. So it's not unlike the wildebeest migration of East Africa, in that you can expect these elk to be coming through these certain corridors and allowing for fun pictures like this, where obviously it's an intentional slowing down of the shutter speed to convey action. Other things that I really enjoy doing are panning. So the same sort of thing when you've got moving animals, to slow your shutter speed down and then follow it, pan it as it's coming by. And knowing that corridor led to an image such as this one. This was right along one of those migratory passes as this elk was moving from Grand Teton National Park. Once it crosses this river, it's on the National Elk Refuge. Another migratory animal that we have in abundance right now is the pronghorn, one of my absolute favorite animals. They're the Ferraris of the animal kingdom, basically. And so these are animals that have extraordinary abilities, but the downside to their abilities is that they don't deal very well with snow. And so during October, typically, as we start to get our first snow, we have a brief window for a moment like this, which is a little bit less common because our pronghorn avoid the deeper snow whenever possible. And so knowing that these guys are about to leave Jackson Hole and migrate south of Jackson Hole into more central Wyoming, we can anticipate some of these moments like this. And of course, when we think about migrations, we think about birds primarily. Large mammals definitely migrate, sometimes short distances, sometimes much longer. But bird migrations are pretty amazing to think about. And I just wanted to cite one example of a bird that does kind of a surprising migration, because this is a rough-legged hawk. And we see rough-legged hawks just about every day, all winter. But if you look at where they're coming from, they are a very Arctic breeding animal. And so they're coming in from northern Canada, coming in from Alaska, and a lot of them end up coming and wintering in this ecosystem, which is kind of cool to think about, especially if we contrast that to something like an osprey or a red-tailed hawk, which they're breeding here right now, and then they're going to migrate, in some cases, very long distances as well, in some cases, South America, winter down there, and then start showing up here every spring, typically in mid-April. Whereas the rough-legged hawk is currently nowhere near here, way up north in their breeding season. That's kind of fun to think about. Sometimes when I'm watching rough-legged hawks along Hudson Bay in October, I wonder if maybe I'm going to be seeing that same individual in Jackson Hole in a couple of months. Probably not, but fun to think about. So let's get into overall understanding animal behavior and how that can help our photography as well. Animals in general, but also a little bit on predators. And when we talk about animal behavior, I think it's worth for a moment talking about our behavior as well. I lead primarily photography trips, and so I get to hang out with a lot of photographers, and in some cases it seems like the idea is it's only a good picture if you're really, really close. And I always try and get people excited about the more landscapey pictures that have wildlife in them. That's my personal preference. And so proximity is a good thing to know about. It's good to know local regulations. In this ecosystem, wolves and bears, you have to be 100 yards or further. Most other animals, it's 25 yards. Up on the top right, you can see not have guests being very responsible. That's a very fine distance to be away from a bison. And if we were in a vehicle, like you see down on the bottom left, you can get even closer. And that's one of the really cool things about these Yellowstone trips are these customized vans. They do have these roof hatches you can see, which serve as excellent blinds and sometimes allow for very unique shots. In this case, they're not using the hatches for wildlife. They're just getting a very different perspective than most people are able to get of one of our geothermal features in Yellowstone. And so one other behavior to think about when it comes to bison has to do with this image right here. And obviously there's nothing very interesting about this, the image itself, but what it does show is a very important behavior that they engage in all winter long. And so most hoof mammals in this ecosystem, they access the food down beneath the snow with their hooves. They're pawing down. Bison do not. They use their entire head. And so what you're seeing here is this bison accessing grass that can be in 2-3 feet of snow. So it's a full-time job just to get to the grass. And so this is a good behavior to watch, because on many people's bucket list to come here during winter is to get a nice frosty bison. And so a frosty bison like this is only going to be frosty if it's a nice cold day and it's been foraging like this. So if you see a bison doing this, you want to take a minute and maybe spend some time with that animal on the off chance that it's going to raise its head and provide one of those sort of classic Yellowstone winter shots. Just like the African Serengeti, we pay very close attention to carcasses, to things that have been killed. These are coyotes and ravens, which have a really strong association with one another on a kill that was made by wolves the previous evening. And kill sites are just, again, just like Africa, it's where you're going to see a lot of dynamics. You'll see coyotes, eagles, magpies, ravens. I've seen badgers on kills, mountain lions. And of course, probably what happened after the coyotes left this, the wolves will move back in, and bears will think about these carcasses as well. And so it's not that uncommon to see a kill like this and to see a back and forth between a pack of wolves and a grizzly bear, basically clashing, competing to get that carcass. Even though it was probably the wolves that took it down, the grizzlies are more than happy to just take that carcass over. And then we come to one of my favorite things about winter. It's not something we see every week by any means, but one of the most beautiful things to see during winter in this ecosystem is a hunting red fox. So red fox, they pounce just like coyotes, and wolves will do this too. You don't see this as much in wolves as you do in red foxes and coyotes. But if the conditions are just right, the snow can't be too soft, it can't be too hard. But these red foxes do this big old leap, which is a real gift to capture in air, like the one on the top. And then, unlike coyotes, at the very last second, they tuck their front legs in and they go jaws first, like this. And so this was just a very lucky moment. Having spent time with this red fox that was hunting, to see it in that very last moment as it was head first in the snow, with its cute little tail sticking up in the air. And this relates to another really amazing thing about this hunting strategy, because this has been studied quite extensively. And you could be thinking, because this is something that a lot of people really do want to go home with, is a picture of a red fox in the air, or that sequence. That's always a fun thing to try and get. But you could, if the conditions are right, you could be thinking about where you want to be in relationship to that hunting animal. Because it turns out that they tend to do it more often when the animal starts out facing northeast. And if they hunt facing any other direction, their success goes down 40 to 50%, which is kind of crazy to think about. And so that could mean that if you think about where northeast is, you could position yourself potentially so that you're not just getting the butt of the animal or whatever, but you could get a profile or direct on. And biologists are not certain why the success is higher, but it is like significantly higher if the animal starts off facing northeast. And most likely has something to do with the magnetic fields, which, if that proves to be true, makes it one of the only animals in the world known to hunt using that. We know that other animals for migrations, birds, fish, do use the magnetic poles for lots of different things, but this might be the only case of a predator using that to be successful. Something seems wrong with that slide. Is it really, really dark?
Yeah, it does look dark for some reason.
Okay, I'll just go. Hopefully, if you can see a little bit of it, I don't know what happened. But what you have here is a coyote howling with the Tetons as a backdrop. And And I was going to use this slide and this one to kind of introduce the idea of finding wolves. We always love finding the red fox and coyotes, but our largest canine is the gray wolf, and oftentimes it's something that many people are traveling here to have the opportunity to view and occasionally photograph. And so we have all sorts of tricks up our sleeves for being successful in finding wolves. We are very successful at finding wolves, but there's lots of different cues that we utilize. We use, of course, the wolf vocalizations. So sometimes we hear the wolves and don't see them, but hearing them will tell us a little bit about their story of that particular day. And then the other thing we listen to are the coyotes. So the coyotes have a very, very rich vocabulary, lots of different things that they have to say. But when wolves are nearby, and so even if we can't see the wolves, if we hear a wolf vocalizing in a certain way, if we hear a coyote vocalize a certain way, we know with great certainty that there's wolves nearby. The coyotes just let us know. We pay very close attention to the ravens as well, because they are oftentimes in strong association with wolves. And wolf photography is tricky, and so I always like to set expectations that an image like this is a relatively close opportunity with a wolf most of the time. And as I said earlier, this is the kind of image that I prefer anyways. We sometimes call these environmentals, or I just sometimes call them landscapes that have animals in them. So I feel like you're more part of the story. You're seeing more of their world than just a nice tight portrait. And so, moments like this would be a great wolf moment where you're seeing part of the story that they do associate with rivers. You're seeing that it's the fall season, and you're seeing them in their unobstructed habitat. Whereas the moments that some people really, really want, like this, are very few and far between. A close moment with a wolf is something that I don't get to experience very often, and I've been hanging out with these wolves of Yellowstone since 1998. And like I said, an image like this is more common and one that I prefer. And moments like these do come to fruition just because of our knowledge of the territories of the different wolf packs, how they interact with the other animals, and always paying attention, of course, to their den sites, their rendezvous sites, which is their meeting site later on in the summer. And knowing all that about them really does increase our chances of success. Just as fun to watch are coyotes. They hunt in a similar fashion in all seasons, and so it's all very much like the red fox, and you can get a sense if you spend time with these animals. You can get a sense of what they're thinking about. Are they just traveling through a big open meadow like this, or do they have stalking and hunting on their mind? And so if you get that vibe, if their posture and the way that they're handling themselves suggest that, that's something that you'll want to spend some time with, because it might take a few minutes, might take a while until they actually do a big leap like that. But to capture something like that is certainly a gift. And then other small things is oftentimes we have the animals moving away from us and walking over towards a ridgeline or whatever, and we start to set our cameras down. And for anyone with me, I always say, make sure you stay with it, because there's a good chance, especially in the case of a coyote, that it's gonna look like it's totally ignoring us, it's moving away, looks like it's just gonna go over the ridge. More likely than not, it's gonna stop before it disappears, give one last look, and then disappear. And that leads to moments like this. As I said, the bears of ecosystem are always interesting, but they just seem to be getting more and more interesting every year. And so we do have the ability to understand these bears and get to know these individual bears. This is a well-known bear that's nicknamed Blondie in the area, that came out of hibernation with one cub of the year this year. So she's been around, she's still doing well. Lots and lots of things to be aware of with bears in order to get better photography. But one obvious thing is just that grizzly bears do stand up on their hind legs, and to be ready for that, because that can also be a pretty quick moment. And then as you get to know individuals, you also pick up on the fact that some bears do this more than others. And so with certain bears, if you know who it is, you might anticipate them standing up more than others, which are just less likely to for whatever reason. It also, even for safety's sake, can be good to know that grizzlies climb trees. Sometimes you hear the joke that the way you tell a black bear from a grizzly is that if you run from it and you climb up a tree, if the black bear goes after you, if the bear goes after you, it's a black bear. If the bear knocks down the tree, it's a grizzly bear. So in other words, black bears are the only bears that climb trees. Here is a picture of grizzlies up trees. And so whenever I see a bear of either species, and I think it might be a mom, I automatically look up and see if there's any cubs that are nearby. And sometimes you can luck out and see cute little black bears or grizzlies. So grizzlies can climb trees, they just don't do it nearly as often as black bears. So yeah, we'll wrap up with just a few images of the unexpected and unpredictable. We had this image up earlier, and you know, it's not my favorite image in terms of its aesthetic value, but I just love it because it captures what I think is one of the most interesting behaviors, not just here, but in North America, if not the world. Because what you have here is a coyote with a badger out in a field hunting together, which honestly and truly, when I think about this behavior, it hurts my brain a little bit because it doesn't make any sense that these animals figured out how to do this together. A lot of us who love wildlife, we're very fascinated by collaborative hunting, whether it's wild dogs, African lions, orcas, gray wolves, because it's complicated. You know, it involves a lot of coordination to hunt something oftentimes bigger than yourself, in the case of gray wolves and lions. And here we have the same sort of thing, but with two totally different species. And so if you ever do come across a coyote out in the meadow, just look carefully and you might see a badger nearby. And so the science behind this is simply that they are both predators. They're both preying on rodents, things like ground squirrels, but they do it in different ways. Badgers are short and stocky and phenomenal diggers, and coyotes typically hunt from above doing that big jump. And so by hanging out together, they have somehow figured out in their amazing brains that they are more successful by being side by side than they are if they're independently. How that conversation starts, I have no idea, but it is an amazing thing to see. And it's not something super common, but it's out of the ordinary. It's not on all of our radar, but what an amazing thing to observe. And in general, in terms of being unpredictable, I'd put the weasel family really high up as being unpredictable. The badgers are a little bit more predictable because they're tied to dens, at least for part of the summer, a little bit more than other weasels. But in general, the weasels we kind of just luck out with. So for example, one of the most fun animals to hang out with. I mean, you couldn't find an animal that depicted just simple joy more than any other thing than a river otter. They play a lot. They're very social, very, very effective hunters, but very difficult to find. At least they're not predictable. There's no like certain place because they're associated with water, of course, but there's a lot of water and they can be in a lot of different places throughout an ecosystem like here. So that's just kind of luck to come across river otters. Same with long-tailed weasels. Anytime you have an opportunity to photograph a weasel, it is a gift because most of the time they give you about 2 seconds. So you might have as much time to reach this far towards your camera and then they're gone. And so this is the same species of weasel. This is a long-tailed weasel. Very effective hunters. As you can see, this one on the right is carrying a pocket gopher, which is an animal that never comes out above ground or the snow, pretty much. And it's actually a bigger animal than the weasel. So they are impressive predators, but hard to predict. Then of course, just magic happens sometimes. This is an image from Yellowstone where these two animals would typically not get along. And this coyote really didn't know what to do with this grizzly bear, because the grizzly bear had been feeding on a carcass happily for days. And so rather than see the coyote as a threat to its food source, this bear was actually trying to get the coyote to play with it. One of the only times I've ever seen a bear and a coyote interact. I've seen wolves and bears interact plenty of times, and it's always aggressive. But this was a happy bear, well-fed bear, and he couldn't understand why the coyote wouldn't engage with them. Coyotes kind of blow the doors off what we like to think we understand about animals, and so this is another sort of off-the-radar behavior that we've only started seeing in Yellowstone the last 2 or 3 years. And this is an example of a fishing coyote. And it's not something that we've really seen in this area until recently. And it's just a really cool thing to have suddenly started seeing a coyote standing in a river and just staring down. So very different hunting strategy than when they can hear the prey under the grass or the snow, or possibly smell it. Here they can't. In this situation, they can't hear it or smell it. And so they become visual hunters, which has been another very surprising thing to witness. Yeah, so just a quick snapshot of the bears of Grand Teton. This is a chart that I put together, having spent, I guess, the last 14 years with a bear that many of you may have heard of, the matriarch of Grand Teton, grizzly bear 399. And this is an example of getting to know not just the species on a personal level, but individuals. With 399 being one of the more visible bears, you can see that we've been spending lots of time with her basically every single summer since 2006. She's been a fairly visible grizzly bear. And if you look at this genealogy chart, you'll see that she's been a very successful mom. Some of the cubs definitely have died. That's not unexpected with grizzly bear cubs. And there's so much going on with the story. I could go on and on, but just wanted to show a snapshot of how, in the case of grizzlies and wolves in particular, we really do get to know many of them on an individual level. And that can be helpful as well, because certain individuals take certain paths, so we can anticipate, okay, this bear is most likely going to come through that part of the woods, in about 10 minutes. That sometimes can work. But so many cool things about the story. But if some of you have followed this amazing bear, 399, she's 24 years old now, and amazed everybody when the park opened after being closed due to the virus. 399 showed up, and people were just hoping that she survived because she's so old, and blew everybody away when she came out with 4 little cubs of the year. And so we've been lucky enough to hang out with her and some of her other offspring that are all part of this this amazing story. So yeah, hopefully that gives you just a brief sense of the values of getting to know animals, their trends, their migrations, how that's tied to plants, which is then tied to the geology, the soil, things like that, and how that might actually benefit our photography. And want to just invite you to check out photography on my website, which is wildthingsofwyoming.com. And there's photography from all over the world, but obviously more from this ecosystem than anywhere else. So, well, it looks like another dark slide. How random. Anyways, I think that's okay. This is the last slide, so I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining me, and sorry for the 2 slides that suddenly went dark on us for some reason.
Oh, that's okay. Technical issues. It's all right. It's understandable. Thank you so much, though, Kurt. That was great. I learned so much from this presentation, so many things I hadn't considered before. So we will get into the Q&A now. So I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field. Okay. Got a little feedback, so I'm going to mute you for a second. Okay, Kurt, first question. A lot of people want to know about the badger and the coyote hunting together, and what are the dynamics of that? How does that work out? Were you able to see them be successful in a kill?
Definitely. Yeah, like I said, if I encourage people who are interested in it, because if you're like me, it's a pretty mind-blowing thing to think about that particular hunting strategy. Um, and if you did look it up, you'd find that there's not been a whole lot of research on it that I've been able to find. And it does seem to happen in certain areas more than others, with Grand Teton maybe being one of the better places to see that behavior. And I only see it maybe once every year, if I'm lucky. So it's not something we expect to see, but it's one of those outliers that if there is a coyote out there, it might be easy to miss that badger because he's so much smaller. Um, but yeah, it's basically been determined that both species success is increased with by hunting collaboratively. It does seem to be more of an advantage to the coyote than the badger, which doesn't surprise me because coyotes are basically too smart for their own good. They are brilliant animal geniuses. Um, and yeah, I don't know. And when we do watch it, we do typically see success more so by the coyotes, and it usually is the ground squirrels. And so basically, if the ground squirrel is underground and the badger's kind of sniffing around digging, he might he might encourage that ground squirrel to leave the burrow, and then it's out in the open, and then the coyote has a greater chance at it. Or the coyote might be out in the grassland, open grass, and startles a rodent that goes underground. The badger then can then quickly dig it up. So yeah, ecology wise, we would call that niche partitioning, which is kind of fun to think about, where you've got in this case, two species using the exact same area in different ways to be successful.
That is so cool. Um, we've got a request that you go back to the slide that had your website URL on there. If you can share your website address again.
Yeah.
People are very interested in seeing your photography.
Oh, that's great to
Perfect.
hear.
And there was actually there's someone listening who was here with you the day you took that shot of the badger and the coyote. So
Oh, I bet I know one of six people that is, I think.
it's Sherry.
Sherry, okay, right on.
There are a lot of people really curious about the camera kit you used. What kind of camera body do you have? What kind of lenses do you use? It probably depends on what you're photographing, but what do you typically bring out with you when you're out guiding?
I bring a lot, and so I carry two bodies, typically one with the landscape lens on and one with a larger lens. Right now it's a 200 to 400. And then of course it can take a converter. But I am happiest, like if I have my 200 forward on, I know that I'm trying to get probably a tight shot. So the lens I call my desert island lens. If I only had one lens to spend the rest of my years with, it would be a 70 to 200 that I rarely put a converter on. And with that, if I have that lens on, I feel like I'm in a happy place because it means I'm going to be able to get part of the landscape, nice lighting. I love backlit wildlife maybe more than anything. I don't think I included any in this talk, but yeah, and I shoot Nikon. I've certainly been open to others as a photography instructor. I try and know a lot of the systems. There's some things I like better about Canon. I just happen to be got a lot invested in Nikon. Hearing great things about Sony. And yeah, just always have bean bags, tripods, monopods, and do a fair bit with my phone. One of the things I think a lot of us are doing more on photo trips is making sure we talk about iPhone photography, because there's so many cool things that these devices do. And one of the things we do a lot of is digiscoping. So most of us carry adapters that allow this to connect to a scope and do videos and things like that, because these scopes are just significantly more powerful than lenses, because they're designed in a different way. You can't get the same quality. It's apples and oranges in a way, which is why I carry both. But yeah, so bring a lot of fun stuff.
Great. I have some wildlife questions for you next.
Yep.
The first one is a pretty common question, I think, is How do you tell the difference between a coyote and a wolf if they're not side by side?
It can be tricky. And yeah, a lot of the talks I give on wolves, I have several slides showing examples. And I'd say, you know, with what I do for a living, I've met many, many people who have come into my office or pulled me aside to show me their wolf picture. And they're so excited that they saw a wolf, and they show me the picture. And I always have to pause and say, well, should I tell them? Because it's actually a coyote. And that's very common. I've seen experts. I've seen some of the foremost experts in wolf biology get it wrong, and because it was so far away, it was like 4 miles. But in general, it's pretty straightforward, just because wolves are 3 times bigger. So size can be helpful, but again, once you get a lot of distance, that can be tricky. One nice thing is that about half of our wolves are black. And so if you see a black canine, it is almost certainly a wolf. There are no black coyotes and very few black foxes. And then we start to look at more subtle things. If we hear them, we can tell the difference between a wolf vocalization and a coyote vocalization. Their ears are a little different. Wolves are a little bit more rounded. Their muzzle is a bit more broad, and they actually walk differently. So it's like telling a black bear from a grizzly bear. That's not always easy either. So we rely on a lot of different things that we're looking at to make that final call of whether or not it's a coyote or a wolf.
Okay, great. And do the long-tailed weasels change color with the seasons?
Yeah, I can go back to that. That's the same animal, same species. So they change color. This is what they look like right now. This is what they look like all winter. You'll notice that they keep a small part of the tail black, and that's actually as a distraction. So if a great horned owl or something's going after the weasel, instead of going for its head, it'll focus on that dot and potentially save the life of that weasel.
So interesting. And speaking of tails, there's a question about red foxes, and someone said they noticed some have a black tip and some have a white tip. And is this due to maturity or seasonality?
No, all of our animals have a different coat, winter versus summer. Whether you're a moose, a bison, a weasel, whether you change colors or not, you have to have a different coat for the 2 seasons. And so red foxes do look different in the summer and the winter, and they also have several different phases. Phase is a misleading word because it's not temporary, but they can be silver, almost black. They can be red, and then occasionally we see something called a cross fox, which is kind of a little bit of gray, a little bit of red. So they vary more than most animals, and they can look quite a bit different from one another.
Great. And someone is curious about the moose in Yellowstone, and if they're being affected by brain wasting disease or some of the other diseases that the moose in Minnesota are experiencing.
I'm not as familiar with what's going on in Minnesota. Our moose are susceptible to disease, and that includes parasites like ticks. I wouldn't be surprised if in Minnesota that was a problem as well. Something called winter ticks can be devastating. In general, our moose population in Jackson Hole is doing well. It was on a downward trend for a while, but it seems to be picking back up. So I'd say our moose population's not quite what it was 10 years ago here, but we are on a rise, which is nice to see. And we're still seeing moose on a regular basis. But we've definitely seen a change in where they're hanging out over the last 10 years. And then Yellowstone's kind of its own beast. We don't see a whole lot of moose in Yellowstone, and that has in part to do with the 88 fires. The 88 fires didn't have a negative impact on that many species, but on moose of Yellowstone, it seems to have. But interestingly, and this is almost a whole presentation in and of itself, many of you have probably heard about how much the reintroduction of wolves into the ecosystem has affected everything. It affected the riparian areas, which affected how the elk behave, which affected the songbirds that breed there, beavers. And one of the things that we're seeing more and more is actually more moose in the northeast corner of the park. So for those familiar with Yellowstone, that's like the Lamar area, Soda Butte Creek area, has been noticeably better for moose in the last few years. And indirectly, that probably has something to do with the wolves coming back, which allowed the willows to return, which, if you heard me say earlier, is a very important food source for moose. And so an unintended consequence of the wolf reintroduction is an improvement in the moose population.
Great. Well, we are just past the hour, so that's the last question we have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back over to you, Kurt, for some closing comments.
Yeah, we just hope to see you out here in Yellowstone. We're doing day trips right now, and it's an interesting summer to be in the parks. It's quieter, so it might be a really good summer to come to Yellowstone. We're still on track to do the fall trips. Everything's looking good there, and it's an amazing time of year. So thank you all so much for joining. If you have any other questions, I'm sure you can track me down online, and hope everyone's healthy, safe, and happy travels whenever that may be.
Thank you so much, Kurt. This was really great, and my thanks to everyone who joined us today. Be sure to join us on Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have that replay up on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.